Welcome back once again to our 2017 block of the month. We are now working on block number 9. This month we're supposed to be working on this block, but it looks so similar to the block we did in block number 1. So we're going to switch it up. Instead, we're going to work on a Dresden plate block. Not your normal block. This one is going to have a new twist. This block is going to have Reverse Applique, Trapunto, and Chenille all in one. So let's get started. Now you may be wondering why your fabric requirements call for 2 layers of your background fabric and just one of each of the other ones. Let me show you why. Do you see how you can see through this? And even if I put it down against my lighter fabric, it may not be as noticeable on the camera, but it gives off a bluish shade. So in order to prevent that, we're using 2 layers of the background fabric, since it's normally lighter than the rest of the fabric you're using. And that's going to prevent the bleed through from one fabric to another, and it also is going to help enhance another technique we're going to use down the road. Once you get your 10-inch layers all cut out, it's now time to print out your template for placement, center it on one of your background fabric pieces, and then we're going to pin it in place to make sure it doesn't shift on us. Now we're going to be tracing this, and as you can see, it shows through pretty well on the lighter fabric. Now if you're using a little bit darker, you can use a light table or take it to the window to trace it. After your template pattern is secured to your outer fabric, go ahead and trace using your favorite marker the outer circle and then the inner circle of the template. After you're done with that, you're going to go ahead with a straight edge of some kind, and this is my absolute favorite ruler for things like this. It's a little 6-inch ruler. It's 1 inch wide, works great for so many things. But I'm going to go ahead using that and trace around all the Dresden plate blades. When I get completely around, I have one more step to do before we start stitching. After I get all the markings done on my foundation, I'm going to remove the fabric, set the template aside, and I'm going to grab that little ruler again and do some more marking. I'm going to find the approximate center of the inner circle, and I'm going to draw a line. Now the nice thing about this ruler is it has a 1/2 inch marking right down through the center. So I'm going to line that up with the first line I drew in the middle and draw a line 1/2 inch on either side of that line. Now if you don't have this ruler, that's okay. I'm sure you'll have something in your bag of tricks that can do the same thing. But what you're looking for is to draw a line down through the middle and then a line 1/2 inch on either side of that line. Once you get the first series of lines done, you're going to go ahead and do it perpendicular to those. So basically when you're all done, you're going to have a box drawn in the center of your circle with 4 squares in it. And it's going to look like this. Now we're going to get ready to put our fabrics together. So first put down the fabric you've chosen for your center of your Dresden plate, and then one of the 2 fabrics you've chosen for the alternate blades of the Dresden plate. It doesn't matter which one you use first. It's totally up to you. Now on top of that, we're going to put the unmarked background square on top of that. And we'll top it off with the square that you just got done marking all the stitching lines on. Now we're going to go ahead and pin in all four corners to hold the fabric together while we stitch on the lines that you just drew. Now comes another decision. Do you want to use a thread color that matches your background, or do you want to use a contrasting thread that blends with the fabrics you've chosen for the Dresden blades? That's totally your call. I'm using a contrast so that you can see what I'm doing. Now let's get started on some stitching. We're going to stitch on all the lines that you've just drawn. I've got my machine set for a little bit shorter stitch, 2.0, and that's so that it holds the fabrics together very closely because we're going to be trimming away later. So the shorter stitch length will really help. It also helps to target those corners more exactly as you're going around each of these blades. Now you're going to continue around each blade, and when we get down to the center, to the circle, we're going to stop and pivot. This is so we don't have to constantly break thread. So we're going to just take a couple stitches here, 2 or 3 should be all you need, and then pivot again and go back up the other blade. You're going to continue around all the Dresden blades. Now we're coming around to the last of the Dresden blades. So we're going to trim off this thread here first, and then we're going to stitch down the blade until we get to the outer circle. We want to go around the circle, so we're going to go ahead at this point and just pivot and stitch. Now I want to explain something to you. Do you see how I keep reaching back to lift up the presser foot so I can turn? I take a couple stitches, stop, lift up the foot. That takes forever to stitch that way. Now I'm moving my hands out to the edge of the square, and I'm treating this like a steering wheel. As I'm stitching, I am turning that steering wheel, and I no longer have to constantly reach up and lift that lever. I can just stitch slowly, and it's good to go. I just thought you'd like that little tip. Now we're going to stitch around this entire circle, and when we get to the point where we started, which is right there, we're going to go ahead and slightly stitch past that point to lock our stitches in place. Now I'm going to lift up the lever so I can reposition my foot and needle over the inner circle. And I'm going to continue to stitch that inner circle just like I did the outer circle, by using the edge of the fabric as a steering wheel. I don't have to constantly reach back and lift up that lever. Now when I get to the point where I started on the inner circle, I am going to continue over until I get to one of the lines on the side of that circle, and I'm going to stitch down. Now this is totally up to you. You can just stitch across and then go back up, or you can follow the circle around. You get down to the middle of the circle. It's easier to just do the square and forget about the other, because we're going to be trimming that away later. Your choice. The basic thing is we need to have the square with the cross in between the square, forming the 4 smaller squares stitched. Now we've gotten all the lines stitched going in one direction, we're going to pivot and go the opposite direction. And as you come to each intersection, all you have to do is pivot and go across. We're coming down to the final wire here, and as we finish this up, we want to lock stitch our stitches, and then we're done. Now is the time to double check to make sure you've stitched on all the lines. If you can't tell from the front, flip it around the back just to be sure. I know you're going to find this hard to believe, but this is going to be your very best friend for the next step. So make friends. We're about to embark on reverse applique, and you need a seam ripper with a nice sharp tip and a nice inner blade. That's the curved part that actually does the cutting. And you can get a hold of the thread of the layer underneath. And remember, we have 2 layers of the top, and now we need to get down to the 3rd layer. So we're just going to grab a thread from that 2nd layer and slice it up. And now we can see that 3rd layer that we're trying to get to. That seam ripper made it so much easier. Something else that will make it easy is a pair of scissors with blades that are sharp, clear to the tip, because we're going to reach in there and we're going to snip all the way up to the point. And you can't be chicken here. You want to go clear to the point without clipping the stitches. And now you're going to take those same scissors and trim away all the extra layers. We have 2 layers that we need to trim away in this case, and we want to go clear into the points in each area to reveal the applique fabric underneath. So you want to get as close to the stitching line as possible without cutting the stitches. Now we're ready to do the alternate color. So we have 1, 2, and then 3 layers to get through before we get to the light blue. So we're going to do this the same way. We're going to grab a thread of the top layer and rip up, revealing the 2nd layer. Grab a thread of that layer, rip up, revealing the 3rd layer. Now carefully grab a thread from this layer and rip up, and now you'll see the layer you need to get to, or the 4th layer. So now it's time to grab your sharp scissors again and snip that all the way up to the point once again and begin to trim. Now you'll notice as I'm trimming, I'm getting very close to the line of stitching without cutting through the stitching line. I also have my scissors almost sideways, and that is grading the fabric layers as well as ensuring I'm not cutting the stitching line. Now if you can't cut through all the layers at the same time, that's okay. You can go a couple layers at a time until you get down to the layer you need to be on. Again, I have to apologize that while I'm doing this trimming, I'm so concentrating on the trimming that I'm not understanding that you can't see what I'm doing. But it'll be coming to you shortly, exactly what I'm doing, so bear with me. So now you can see we have two alternate blade colors or fabrics, and that's what we're going to do all the way around all the blades. Keep alternating your layers as you trim. And again, through the magic of video, here we are coming around to our final blade. Everything's trimmed out. I'm going to do a few final clips there, little snips here and there, just to make sure that we're as close to that stitching line as we possibly can. And we've saved the best for last. Since you've gotten so good at that clipping, now we're going to clip out the center of the Dresden plate. This is another one of those little twists that I was referring to. And we're basically going to do the same thing that we did for the reverse applique, in that we're going to take our seam ripper and we're going to rip away all the various layers in those little squares. This time we're not alternating colors, but instead we're getting down to the last color. Now in this case, if you recall, I used gold as my bottom layer. So we're going to keep snipping into the corners, and we're going to keep using our seam ripper and peeling away a little bit at a time, just like peeling an onion, until we get down to that last layer of gold. Feel like I'm digging for gold here. But each time you cut through a layer, clip clear into the corners. Now I see the light blue, so that means that we have one more layer to go and we'll be there. So carefully we're going to again take the point of the seam ripper, and you want to just grab a thread of that bottom layer and split. And there's the gold hiding down in there. And you're going to do that with each one of these squares. Now you're going to see video in the upcoming clips that is missing something, but I'm going to explain that to you right now. In addition to trimming away those squares, you also want to trim those semi-oval shapes right in there along the lines marked with the magenta dots, because if you don't, we won't be filling out the full circle. You also want to clip that fabric down to the circular stitching as shown by the solid magenta line. Now it's time to finish up these Dresden plate blades. I've got my machine set for a stitch width of 3 and a stitch length of 0.5. And I'm going to stitch around each of these blades. Now when you get to the corners, you want to always make sure that your needle stops on the outside before you pivot. Otherwise, you'll have a break in your line of stitching and it won't be as attractive. When you get up to this point, which is a sharper point, you want to put your needle down, turn the blade parallel, take one stitch back and forth, and again with your needle in the down position on the outer fabric, stitch back down to the next corner. Now that sharp point in the center is the only place where you really need to do that extra stitch to make that point sharp. And I'm going to show you on the next blade a little slower how this stitching is being done. I have my foot centered right along the raw edge of the fabric, and you can see that it's hitting the applique fabric and it's also hitting the background fabric. That's exactly what you want. And you can also see that that 0.5 stitch length is giving great coverage. Now as I get up here to the corner, I want you to watch the needle closely. So right here, we're going to sink that needle down into the background fabric, and then we're going to pivot. Now we can continue on with our stitching, and we're still centered up with the foot on the raw edge of the fabric. Now as we come up to the peak of the Dresden blade, you'll notice it's a little sharper point. So I'm going to do a little extra step here. I'm going to sink the needle into the outer fabric. I'm going to turn the fabric so it's parallel to that blade and take 2 stitches, one onto the applique fabric and one back onto the background fabric. Now I pivot and I'm ready to go back into the next point. The reason I did that is because that is such a sharp point. You want to make sure that you're not getting an extra stitch on your background fabric. Taking those extra 2 stitches ensures a very sharp point instead of rounding it off. Once you get to the next corner, because it's not such a sharp point, those extra 2 stitches aren't necessary, and you can just instead make sure your needle's in the outer fabric and then pivot and go back down to where you left off. Now you're going to come down to the outer circle and you're going to stop there. You don't have to worry about tying knots, because as we stitch the outer circle with this stitch that we're doing now, that will lock your stitches in place. After you've finished stitching all the Dresden blades, now it's time to go in and stitch the center. What you're going to do is center your foot on the stitching line, the previous stitching line that you had stitched. We're going to use the same trick that we did before. Use the outer edges of your fabric to turn the fabric around as you stitch, and you won't have to keep reaching back to lift the presser foot as you go around. Once you get the outer circle stitched, you'll want to also stitch the inner circle. Don't forget, as I reminded you before, do those extra clips before you proceed, even though it's not showing in the video. Now you're going to take a squirt bottle with water and just lightly mist that center. The next thing you're going to need is a nice stiff brush. It can be a toothbrush. I'm using a grout brush, anything with stiff bristles. And now you're going to scrub. Just keep scrubbing and scrubbing and scrubbing along those clips that you made in the center. And again, remember, we're going to have the ones going down into those semi-oval areas also that are going to fluff up. You're going to continue brushing. Now, we want to see some of that gold or whatever you chose for your bottom layer. But if you don't see it through all the squares, or you don't see a solid gold effect, don't worry about it. What we're trying to accomplish here is to have a little bit of the chosen color showing through, but we're mainly concerned with making the chenille here. And that's accomplished by brushing on those trim back areas. Once they're all brushed, you'll see the threads start to fray quite a bit. You may even have to give it a little bit of a haircut as you proceed. But you can see them fluffing up. Now this is going to show you the difference between just cutting the inner squares and then going around and cutting the semi-oval squares. Do you see how the center is totally filled in now? It looks much better. So that's basically all you have to do to create that fluffy chenille center for your Dresden plate. This next portion of your block construction, or I guess we should say deconstruction, is just trimming away all that excess fabric in the back. You're going to trim around each of the Dresden blades, and you can do this one layer at a time, multiple layers at a time, whatever it takes. You want to go all the way around and remove all the extra fabric. Once you've completed all the trimming, the only thing left to do is to square up your block to 9.5 inches. Well, friends, this brings us to an end of another block of the month. I hope you've enjoyed this. Next month, we're going to put the whole quilt together and get started on free motion quilting. So I'll see you then. Goodbye.